In the forgotten hollows of 1860s Pennsylvania, nestled deep within the Allegheny Mountains, stood a sprawling estate that promised salvation. But behind its pristine white fences and manicured lawns, two brothers, identical in face but not in soul, were bound together by a secret so monstrous it defied God and nature. They shared everything: a home, a dark ambition, and even, in a way that chills the blood, a single unwitting bride. Now I need you to understand, this isn't a ghost story, this isn't folklore whispered around a campfire. This is the true documented account of how twin brothers, lauded as pioneers of medicine and charity, manipulated the wealthiest families in America, building a private empire founded on a single terrifying lie. They created one family, a grotesque parody of a normal home, but it was just the beginning of their project. Welcome, truth seekers, to Shadow Stories. What you are about to hear has been deliberately buried by history, sealed away in court documents, and dismissed as a local legend. Why? Because the truth implicates more than just two twisted individuals. It indicts an entire era. This channel is for the brave, for those who aren't afraid to stare into the abyss. So, I have to ask you right now, do you have the courage to see what was hidden in that lonely valley? If you do, prove it. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and comment with your city or state to let us know you've officially joined the investigation. Let's unearth this together. Now let's set the stage, because the horror of this story can only be understood by looking at the world it was born from. Picture America in 1866. The Civil War has just ripped the nation apart, leaving scars on the landscape and on the minds of its people. It was an era of profound contradiction. On one hand, you have the dawn of the Gilded Age, unprecedented wealth, roaring factories, cities exploding with new immigrants, and a boundless faith in science and progress. Men like Carnegie and Rockefeller were forging empires of steel and oil. But beneath this glittering surface was a deep, festering anxiety. The war had shown the fragility of life, and the new sciences, while promising miracles, also introduced terrifying new ideas. Phrenology claimed you could read a man's character from the bumps on his skull. Social Darwinism was being twisted into a justification for the cruelty of the factory floor and the squalor of the slums. And most insidiously, the seeds of eugenics were being sown, the belief that society's ills, from poverty and crime to madness and melancholy, were not social problems, but biological ones. A sickness in the bloodline. For the new American aristocracy, the titans of industry and finance, image was everything. They built grand mansions and funded operas, desperate to wash away the grit of their origins and establish themselves as a new nobility. But what do you do when your own family carries the stain of imperfection? An eccentric son, a melancholic wife, a daughter born with a minor deformity. In an age of brutal public judgment and non-existent mental health care, these family members were not seen as people in need of help, but as liabilities. They were living, breathing threats to a family's reputation and fortune, secrets to be hidden away at any cost. This desperate need for discretion, this societal obsession with purity and appearance, created a perfect dark market for a very specific and very monstrous kind of service. It created the perfect hunting ground for predators disguised as saviors. Into this world of gilded anxiety stepped the identical twin brothers, Dr. Alistair Finch and Silas Croft Finch. To the public, particularly to the elite of Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, they were figures of immense respect and admiration. Dr. Alistair Finch was the face of the operation. He was impossibly handsome, with a compassionate gaze and a voice that could soothe the most troubled soul. He'd studied at the finest medical schools in Europe and published papers on restorative neurology, a field he essentially invented. He spoke of new humane treatments for the mentally afflicted, moving away from the brutal asylums of the past and towards personalized care in a tranquil pastoral setting. He was a visionary, a philanthropist, a man of science and God. His twin brother, Silas, was his perfect shadow. While Alistair charmed drawing rooms and medical societies, Silas managed the burgeoning Finch-Croft empire with silent, terrifying efficiency. He was the man who handled the finances, the logistics, the acquisitions of land, and, most importantly, the security. Where Alistair was warm and loquacious, Silas was cold, watchful, and spoke only when necessary. He wore the same tailored suits as his brother, had the same piercing blue eyes, but lacked any of the doctor's performative warmth. People whispered that while the good doctor could heal you, Silas could make you disappear. Together, they were a formidable unit, a two-headed serpent of charisma and control. They presented themselves as the ultimate solution for the wealthy elite's most private and embarrassing problems, a discreet service wrapped in the unimpeachable authority of modern medicine. They were the perfect villains for their time, because no one could even conceive that they were villains at all. They weren't just hiding in plain sight, they were being celebrated in it, their darkness completely invisible under the blinding glare of their reputation. The cover story they crafted was a masterpiece of marketing and manipulation, a siren song for desperate families with skeletons in their closets. They called it the Finch-Croft Sanatorium for restorative therapies. The name itself was brilliant. Sanatorium evoked health and sanitation, not madness, and restorative therapies suggested a gentle, holistic healing process. They published beautiful, expensive brochures filled with etchings of serene landscapes, elegant private rooms, and patients engaged in genteel activities like painting, gardening, and reading. The text, written in Alistair's eloquent and persuasive prose, spoke of a revolutionary approach. It decried the barbarism of state-run asylums and promised a haven of dignity, discretion, and recovery. The sanatorium, they claimed, was designed for a specific clientele. Individuals from good families suffering from nervous afflictions, hereditary melancholy, female hysteria, or the consequences of artistic temperaments. These were all Gilded Age code words for conditions that were inconvenient, embarrassing, or misunderstood. I want you to picture a wealthy industrialist in 1866. His son is a poet who prefers the company of other men. His wife, after 6 children, has sunk into a deep depression. His daughter refuses to marry the business partner he's chosen for her. These are not medical problems, these are social and financial threats. Dr. Finch offered a simple, elegant solution. For an exorbitant fee, paid annually and in advance, he would take these patients into his care. He promised to restore them to productive and compliant members of society. If a full recovery wasn't possible, he guaranteed they would live out their days in comfort and absolute privacy, far from the prying eyes of the world. This was the core of the bargain. We will take your shame, and in return, you will give us your money and your silence. The families were not just customers. They became co-conspirators. They didn't want to ask too many questions. They didn't want to know the details of the restorative therapies. They just wanted the problem to go away, and the Finch brothers sold them a beautiful, expensive, and utterly believable lie. The sanatorium itself was a physical manifestation of this grand deception, an architectural embodiment of the brothers' twisted vision. Located in a secluded valley, miles from the nearest town and accessible only by a single privately owned road, the estate was designed to be both inviting and impenetrable. From the main gate, a visitor would see a stunning 3-story Victorian mansion painted a brilliant white with cheerful blue trim. This was the public face of the institution, the administrative building, the luxurious reception halls, the dining rooms, and the elegant suites for visiting family members. It was surrounded by acres of rolling hills, pristine gardens, a tranquil lake, and scenic walking paths. It looked like a resort, a paradise of healing. But this was only the east wing. Connected by a long enclosed colonnade but conceptually a world away was the west ward. This building was not featured in any of the brochures. It was built of stern grey stone with narrow barred windows. It was here that the majority of the patients were housed, kept under constant watch and heavy sedation. Yet even the west ward was a facade for the true heart of the operation. Hidden from all official blueprints and accessible only through a locked door in the basement of the west ward, was a stone staircase that descended deep into the earth. This led to what the staff simply called the surgical theatre and the laboratories. This sub-basement complex was a windowless, soundproofed bunker of tile and iron. It contained operating rooms, recovery cells, a crematorium for disposing of medical waste, and cages. Yes, cages for the most difficult or unsuccessful experiments. The entire compound, was surrounded by a 10-foot-high wrought iron fence topped with sharpened spikes. It was patrolled day and night by a private security force handpicked by Silas Croft, men who were chosen for their loyalty and their lack of curiosity. The illusion of a peaceful retreat was maintained with meticulous care, but the reality was a fortress, a prison designed to keep the world out and its secrets and its victims securely locked inside. Of course, an operation of this scale, no matter how remote, could not exist in a total vacuum. There were bound to be oddities, things that local townspeople or the more observant staff might notice. A strange chemical smell from the incinerator chimney at night, the sheer volume of supplies being carted in, crates of ether, chloroform, surgical steel and restraints far exceeding what a simple rest home would require. The unsettling lack of patients ever seen leaving the grounds for good. And then there were the sounds. On still nights, faint, muffled screams might drift from the direction of the West Ward, sounds that were too desperate, too raw to be dismissed as simple therapeutic distress. For every one of these potential red flags, Dr. Alistair Finch had a prepared, plausible, and disarming explanation. The chemical smells, advanced sanitation protocols necessary to prevent the spread of consumption and other airborne maladies. The excessive supplies. We are not merely a sanatorium, but a premier research institution on the cutting edge of neurological science. Such work requires extensive resources. The fact that patients never seem to leave. Recovery from profound hereditary ailments is a lifelong process, my dear sir. We offer our patients permanent sanctuary, a kindness their families are deeply grateful for. And the screams? Alistair would adopt a look of grave sadness. It is a tragic reality that some radical therapies designed to jolt a mind back from the brink can be momentarily distressing for the patient. It is a sound of healing, not of harm. We weep with them even as we save them. His immense reputation, combined with the economic benefits the sanatorium brought to the impoverished local area in the form of jobs and purchases, made people want to believe him. They wanted to see him as the benevolent genius the local boy made good. Cognitive dissonance was too great. It was easier to accept the comforting lie than to contemplate the horrifying alternative. His explanations didn't just satisfy curiosity, they actively discouraged it, painting anyone who questioned him as ignorant of modern science or insensitive to the suffering of the afflicted. No tyrant, no matter how brilliant or powerful, can operate alone. They require a lieutenant, an enforcer who shares their vision and is willing to carry out the dirtiest of work without question. For the Finch brothers, this indispensable cog in their machine of horrors was the head matron of the West Ward, a formidable German immigrant named Nurse Eva Brandt. Eva was not a simple employee. She was a true believer, a fanatical acolyte of Dr. Alistair Finch's depraved ideology. She had come to America with a background in nursing, but also with a mind steeped in the darkest corners of European social theory. She held a fervent, almost religious belief in blood purity and the necessity of pruning the unfit from the human family tree. In Dr. Finch, she saw not an employer, but a prophet, a man with the courage to do what was necessary to cleanse humanity of its weaknesses. She ruled the West Ward with an iron fist and a chilling lack of empathy. It was Eva who administered the daily doses of laudanum and other sedatives that kept the patient population docile. It was Eva who selected patients for Dr. Finch's special therapies in the sub-basement theatre, often based on her own cruel judgments of their worthiness. She enforced a brutal code of silence among the junior nurses and orderlies, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Any staff member who showed too much sympathy for a patient, who asked one too many questions, or who simply seemed unreliable, would be reported to Silas Croft and would disappear without a trace, their departure explained away as a family emergency or a sudden resignation. Eva was the gatekeeper to the sanatorium's inner hell. She was the one who would greet new arrivals, her smile a thin, brittle mask over a core of cold steel, stripping them of their personal belongings and their identities, assigning them a number and leading them through the locked doors from which most would never return. Her complicity was not passive, it was zealous and absolute. She was the high priestess of Alistair's dark church, and her devotion made her, in many ways, even more terrifying than the brothers themselves. So, who were the unfortunate souls who ended up behind the spiked fences of the Finch-Croft Sanatorium? It's crucial to understand that they were not, for the most part, the violently insane or the clinically disabled that filled the public asylums of the era. The victims of the Finch brothers were selected for a very different reason. They were inconvenient. They were the thorns in the side of the Gilded Age elite. Think of the young heir who, instead of showing an interest in the family business, wrote poetry, drank too much, and harbored a deviant attraction to other men. His father, terrified of scandal and eager to pass the company to a more stable younger son, would see Dr. Finch's sanatorium as the perfect solution, or consider the intelligent, outspoken wife of a powerful politician, a woman who knew about his corrupt dealings and threatened to expose him. A diagnosis of female hysteria from a complicit family doctor, followed by a quiet nighttime transfer to the care of Dr. Finch, would silence her forever. There were artists, thinkers, and social reformers whose radical ideas embarrassed their conservative families. There were young women who had become pregnant out of wedlock, their condition a stain on the family's honor that needed to be erased. There were children born with physical deformities, a clubfoot, a cleft palate, a prominent birthmark, who were seen as living symbols of a flawed bloodline. And perhaps most tragically, there were those who were perfectly healthy, but simply stood in the way of an inheritance. A healthy older brother, a stepmother with a life estate. Dr. Finch and his brother Silas offered a permanent, discreet, and medical solution to these frustrating obstacles. These victims shared one common trait. They had been rendered powerless by their own families, who paid a fortune to have them defined as sick, mad, or defective. They were stripped of their names, their rights, and their futures, becoming little more than raw material for Dr. Finch's monstrous ambitions. They arrived as people. They were quickly transformed into case numbers, subjects in a generational experiment from which there was no escape. For years, the Finch-Croft Sanatorium operated with perfect, chilling secrecy. The walls were high, the staff was terrified, and the wealthy families paying the bills were motivated by their own shame to keep silent. The system was flawless, but even the most perfectly designed machine can be broken by a single random event. That event came in the form of a 16-year-old local boy named Finn O'Malley. Finn was not a hero or an investigator. He was just a skinny, hard-working kid who had taken a job as a stable hand on a neighboring farm to help support his family. His life was a simple routine of mucking out stalls, feeding horses, and dreaming of a world beyond the narrow confines of his valley. The sanatorium on the next hill was a place of awe and mystery, a grand estate that employed some of the townsfolk and was spoken of in hushed, respectful tones. One sweltering summer night, a violent thunderstorm rolled through the valley. A bolt of lightning struck a tree near the farm's pasture, spooking the horses. One of them, a spirited mare, broke through a fence and bolted, galloping off into the woods in the direction of the sanatorium grounds. Finn's boss, a pragmatic old farmer, told him to let it be until morning, but Finn, worried the horse would injure herself, grabbed a lantern and set off into the rainy darkness. He tracked the mare through the woods, her trail leading him right up to the sanatorium's imposing back fence, near a small, ugly brick building he'd never paid much attention to before. The incinerator. As he crouched in the bushes, trying to coax the nervous horse, the incinerator door creaked open, spilling a hellish orange light into the night. Two figures in long, dark coats, their faces hidden by the shadows of their hats, dragged something heavy and wrapped in canvas from a nearby shed. They were clumsy in their haste, and as they struggled to heave their burden into the roaring furnace, the canvas slipped. For one horrifying, unforgettable second, illuminated by the fire and a flash of lightning, Finn saw it. It wasn't medical waste. It wasn't an animal. It was the naked, pale, and horribly misshapen form of a human body, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. He saw a flash of long, dark hair. It was a woman. Finn clapped a hand over his mouth to stifle his own scream, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard he thought it would break. He had just become the accidental witness to an execution. The image he saw that night burned itself into Finn O'Malley's mind. a permanent scar on his young soul. The sight of that pale, broken body being fed to the flames shattered his innocence and plunged him into a world of terror he couldn't have imagined. He scrambled back through the woods, leaving the horse, his lantern, everything, his only instinct to flee. He burst into his family's small farmhouse, drenched and trembling, babbling incoherently about what he'd witnessed. His parents, seeing his hysterical state, initially tried to soothe him, assuming he'd been spooked by the storm or had seen a dead deer and his imagination had run away with him. But Finn was relentless. He described the men, the fire, the shape of the body, with a frantic, detailed clarity that began to unnerve them. The next day, his father, a decent but deeply cautious man, agreed to take him to the town sheriff. The sheriff, a man who owed his position in no small part to the generosity of the Finch-Croft estate, listened to Finn's story with a tired, dismissive air. A boy's fantasy, he concluded, fueled by ghost stories and the storm. When Finn's father pressed the issue, the sheriff reluctantly agreed to look into it, but the damage was already done. Word spread through the small community. The O'Malley boy was telling mad stories, seeing things that weren't there. Maybe he was touched in the head. His friends began to avoid him. The farmer he worked for, fearing trouble with the powerful sanatorium, let him go. Finn became an outcast, a pariah in his own home. He couldn't sleep, and when he did, nightmares of the fire and the twisted body jolted him awake. He became paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder, convinced that the men in the dark coats were coming for him. He was trapped in a nightmare, where he was the only one who knew the truth, and the world had decided he was insane. His desperate attempt to expose the darkness had only succeeded in pulling that darkness over his own life, isolating him completely. The sheriff, mostly to placate Finn's increasingly concerned father, and to be seen as doing his job, eventually paid a formal visit to the Finch-Croft Sanatorium. He didn't send a deputy. He went himself, a clear sign that this was a matter of courtesy, not a serious investigation. He was met at the door not by a subordinate, but by the esteemed Dr. Alistair Finch himself, who greeted him with a warm handshake and an expression of gentle concern. The doctor led the sheriff into his magnificent sun-drenched office, offered him the finest coffee, and listened with patient gravity as the sheriff awkwardly relayed the boy's fanciful tale. When the story was finished, Dr. Finch sighed, the picture of weary benevolence. He explained, his voice full of compassion, that the institution did indeed have a high-capacity incinerator. "My dear sheriff," he said, "we are on the cutting edge of anatomical research. We often use animal subjects, pigs, mostly. Their anatomy is remarkably similar to our own, to pioneer new surgical techniques that will one day save human lives. We had to euthanize and dispose of one such subject last night. It was a large sow. Perhaps in the storm, in the flickering light, the poor boy's mind played tricks on him. It's tragic, but understandable." He then went a step further, showing the sheriff a purchase order for a large pig from a farm several counties away, and a detailed entry in a medical log about an anatomical study. The documents were pristine, the logic unassailable. He even expressed deep sympathy for Finn. "The boy is clearly imaginative and sensitive," Alistair concluded. "Perhaps the pressures of his young life are too much for him. If his family finds they are unable to manage his episodes, please let them know my doors are always open. We have experience with such troubled youths." It was a masterstroke of plausible deniability, simultaneously providing a perfect explanation while subtly threatening to turn the accuser into the accused, to label Finn as a potential patient himself. The sheriff, relieved and suitably impressed, left the sanatorium convinced the matter was settled. The official inquiry was closed. While Finn was being dismissed as a madman and the authorities were being charmed into complicity, the true work of the sanatorium continued unabated within the walls of the West Ward. And here we must confront the horrifying nature of what Dr. Finch considered success. From time to time, a family would be summoned to the sanatorium for a progress update on their loved one. They would be ushered into a private parlor in the pristine East Wing, where Dr. Finch would join them, his face radiating professional pride. Then, Nurse Brandt would escort the cured patient into the room. "I want you to picture this reunion. A wife comes to see the husband who was admitted for his artistic temperament and bouts of melancholy. The man who enters is her husband, yes, but the fire in his eyes is gone. He walks with a slow, shuffling gait. He speaks only when spoken to, in a flat, emotionless monotone. He no longer talks of poetry or politics. He seems content to simply sit and stare at his hands. The wife is initially horrified by this vacant shell of the man she married, but Dr. Finch is there to reframe the horror as a miracle. "You see," he would say, his voice a gentle murmur, "the agitation is gone. The destructive passions have been soothed. We have quieted the storm. He is placid now. He is manageable." The families, desperate to believe, would cling to these words. They had paid for a solution, and this was the solution they were given. A son who was once rebellious and defiant was now docile and obedient. A daughter who once screamed and fought against her gilded cage was now quiet and passive, her hysteria replaced by a permanent, haunting stillness. These were the living evidence of Alistair Finch's work. He wasn't healing people, he was erasing them, systematically dismantling their personalities through a terrifying regimen of heavy sedation, psychological torture, and, for the most resistant cases, the crude, horrific procedure that was his specialty, the transorbital lobotomy. He was parading his victims as triumphs, and in their vacant eyes, the families saw not the horror of what had been lost, but the peace they had paid so dearly to purchase. To truly grasp the depths of Alistair Finch's depravity, we must look beyond the physical horrors of the sanatorium and into the twisted ideology that fueled them. Finch was more than just a sadist or a conman. He was a true believer in his own monstrous philosophy, a philosophy he meticulously documented in a series of leather-bound journals. These journals, written in a tight, precise script and filled with a complex personal cipher, were his life's work. They revealed a mind obsessed with a warped vision of human perfection. He saw humanity not as a species of individuals, but as a flawed herd that needed a firm scientific hand to guide its evolution. He believed that all of society's undesirable traits, rebellion, creativity, melancholy, passion, deviance, were genetic defects, cancers on the bloodline that had to be surgically excised. His restorative therapies were a three-pronged assault on human nature itself. First came surgical intervention. He experimented with crude psychosurgeries, refining the ice-pick lobotomy long before it became infamous, severing the connections in the brain that he believed housed a person's defective personality. Second was a program of forced sterilization, ensuring that his cured but still genetically tainted patients could never reproduce. But the third and most diabolical part of his methodology was a secret eugenics program. He would select his most placid male and female patients, those whose spirits he had completely broken, and force them to cohabitate and produce offspring within the sanatorium's walls, hoping to breed a new line of perfectly docile, obedient human beings. This is the horrifying truth behind the script's title, the concept of the twin brothers who married the same woman. It was not a literal marriage, but a symbolic one. Alistair and Silas, the twin architects of this hell, saw themselves as joint fathers of this new bloodline. They selected a specific female patient, a woman from a once great family whose mind had been completely erased by their therapies, and designated her as the symbolic bride for their project, the vessel through which they would create their master race. She was married not to a man, but to their ideology, and her children would belong to them, the first generation of a new humanity, born and raised in a cage. Just when it seemed the darkness in the valley was absolute and impenetrable, a new element was introduced into the volatile equation. A new piece was placed on the board, one the Finch brothers could not have anticipated. This was Dr. Elias Thorne. Elias was, in many ways, a younger version of the man Alistair Finch pretended to be. He was a brilliant, compassionate, and deeply idealistic physician from a respectable Boston family. But his idealism had been brutalized by his experience as a surgeon in the Union Army during the Civil War. He had spent 4 years in field hospitals, performing an endless succession of amputations, surrounded by the screams of dying men. The sheer, senseless butchery of it all had left him disillusioned with conventional medicine. He longed for a way to heal not just the body, but the mind and the spirit, to build rather than to cut. It was this deep-seated desire that made him the perfect mark for Dr. Alistair Finch's propaganda. When Elias came across one of the sanatorium's elegant brochures and later read Dr. Finch's published articles on humane neurological care, he felt a surge of hope for the first time in years. Here, it seemed, was a place that shared his values. Here was a pioneer who was turning away from the barbarism of the past and embracing a future of gentle, restorative healing. He saw the Finch-Croft Sanatorium not just as a job opportunity, but as a calling. He wrote a passionate letter to Dr. Finch, detailing his own philosophies and his desire to be part of such a revolutionary endeavor. Alistair, always an astute judge of character, saw in Elias's letter the perfect pawn. An earnest, talented, and slightly naive young doctor on his staff would only add to the sanatorium's legitimacy. He immediately offered Elias a senior position, praising his rare insight and compassionate spirit. And so, Dr. Elias Thorne packs his bags and traveled to the remote Pennsylvania Valley, arriving full of hope, ready to dedicate his life to a noble cause. He had no idea he was voluntarily walking into the belly of the beast. Dr. Elias Thorne's first few weeks at the Finch-Croft Sanatorium were a strange mix of inspiration and unease. On the surface, everything was just as the brochures had promised. He was given a beautiful suite of rooms in the East Wing, treated with the utmost respect by Dr. Alistair Finch, and was initially impressed by the apparent tranquility of the grounds. Dr. Finch was a charming and attentive mentor, spending hours with Elias discussing medical theory and philosophy, always managing to stay just vague enough when it came to the specifics of his restorative therapies. But cracks in the pristine facade began to appear almost immediately. Elias, with his sharp clinical eye, noticed things. He noticed the pervasive scent of laudanum that seemed to hang in the air around the West Ward, a sweetness that failed to mask an underlying odor of fear and unwashed bodies. He was troubled by the patients he was allowed to see. They were unnervingly passive, their conversations stilted and empty, their eyes lacking any spark of life. His requests to review patient files before their admission were politely but firmly denied by Nurse Eva Brandt, who informed him that Dr. Finch handled all preliminary diagnostics personally. The junior staff were a particular source of concern. They were skittish and evasive, their eyes constantly darting towards their superiors. They spoke in whispers and would fall silent the moment Elias or Nurse Brandt entered a room. He once tried to strike up a conversation with a young nurse about a patient's history, only to have her give a terrified shake of her head and hurry away. The deepest source of his suspicion, however, was the rigid segregation of the facility. He was a senior physician, yet he was effectively barred from entering the West Ward without being escorted by Nurse Brandt, and his inquiries about the sub-basement were met with a cold, dismissive stare. Elias began to feel less like a colleague and more like a carefully managed guest, shown only what his hosts wanted him to see. His disillusionment from the war had given him a keen nose for deception, and his instincts were screaming that something was profoundly wrong. He started keeping a private journal, just as Alistair Finch did, but Elias's was filled with questions, observations, and a growing sense of dread. He knew he was on dangerous ground, and that uncovering the truth would require him to become a spy within the very institution he had come to serve. All right, let's pause here for a second. I want you to put yourself in Dr. Thorne's shoes. It's 1866. There are no phones to call for help, no internet to research your suspicions. You are isolated miles from anywhere, surrounded by a private army. Your boss is one of the most respected men in the country, and the person showing you the deepest kindness. Everyone around you is either a true believer or is too terrified to speak. What do? Do you pack your bags and flee, leaving those patients to their fate? Do you confront Dr. Finch, risking being labeled insane yourself and becoming the next patient in the West Ward? Or do you stay and risk everything to find proof? It's easy for us to judge from the safety of our screens, but the courage it takes to be the lone voice of sanity in a world of madness is almost unimaginable. Think about it, and if this story has gripped you, if you're feeling that same chill of dread that Elias must have felt, take a moment to hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that stories like this, the ones buried by history, need to be heard. Now let's get back to it, because Elias is about to make his choice. Elias knew that direct confrontation was suicide. His only hope was to find irrefutable proof, something so damning it could shatter the Finch brothers' reputation and bring the force of the law down upon them. His target became Alistair Finch's private office, a room he suspected held the sanatorium's true records. The key, he realized, lay in finding an ally, however unwilling, on the inside. He focused his attention on a young, perpetually terrified junior nurse named Clara. He'd seen the flicker of horror in her eyes during one of Dr. Finch's progress demonstrations, and had noticed the way she flinched whenever Nurse Brandt spoke to her. For weeks, Elias worked to gain her trust, not with direct questions, but with small acts of kindness, a shared cup of tea, a word of praise for her work, a moment of genuine concern when she looked unwell. He was playing a dangerous game, trying to build a bridge of trust in a fortress of fear. Finally, one rainy afternoon, his patience paid off. He found Clara weeping silently in a linen closet. With gentle probing, her story tumbled out. Her younger brother had a gambling problem, and Silas Croft had helped her family with the debt, essentially buying her service and her silence. She was trapped. Elias saw his opening. He didn't ask her to be a hero. He simply asked for a small act of defiance. He told her he believed something was wrong and needed to see the real patient records to help them. He needed the key to Nurse Brandt's office, where a master set of keys was kept. Terrified, but seeing a glimmer of hope in Elias's earnest face, Clara agreed. The next night, during her shift, she feigned a medical emergency in a distant room, drawing Nurse Brandt away from her post. In those precious few minutes, Clara slipped into the matron's office, took an impression of the master key in a bar of soap she had hidden, and replaced it without being noticed. 2 days later, a newly cut key was discreetly passed to Elias. That night, with his heart pounding in his chest, he unlocked Alistair Finch's office. Inside, he found them, the leather-bound, coded journals. For the next 3 weeks, Elias Thorne lived a double life, treating patients by day and by night, hunched over the journals, painstakingly deciphering Finch's twisted thoughts. What he found was worse than anything he could have imagined. It was all there. The surgical experiments, the sterilizations, the murders disguised as medical failures, the eugenics program, and, most damningly, a list of every prominent family who had paid for their services. He now held the truth in his hands, a truth so monstrous it could burn down the entire Gilded Age aristocracy. The moment the last of the cipher fell into place, Elias knew his time at the sanatorium was over. He was no longer a doctor, he was a witness, and the journals were his testimony. Staying any longer was a death sentence. He had to get the journals, particularly the one detailing the financial transactions and the list of complicit families, out of the sanatorium and to the authorities in Philadelphia. He began to plan his escape with the meticulous detail of a prisoner of war. He knew he couldn't just walk out the front gate. Silas Croft's guards were not mere gatekeepers. They were watchers, and any unscheduled departure would be met with suspicion and force. He identified a section of the perimeter fence on the far side of the lake that was partially obscured by a thicket of overgrown rhododendrons. He began to secretly hoard supplies, a small amount of food, a dark set of clothes, and a waterproof oilskin pouch to protect the precious journal. He sewed the pouch into the lining of his coat. He knew he had to act on the night of the next new moon, when the darkness would be his only ally. But he had underestimated the cunning of the other twin. While Alistair was the grand visionary, Silas was the pragmatist, the watcher. He had noticed the change in Dr. Thorne. The young doctor's questions had stopped. His demeanor had shifted from inquisitive to guarded. He spent too much time alone in his room. Silas, a creature of pure suspicion, began to have Elias followed. The night Elias chose for his escape, a storm was brewing, a mirror of the night Finn O'Malley had witnessed the horror at the incinerator. As Elias slipped out of a side door of the east wing and made his way towards the lake, 2 of Silas's guards were already detaching from the shadows to follow him. The quiet escape devolved into a desperate, heart-pounding chase. Elias heard the snap of a twig behind. him, and broke into a dead run, crashing through the underbrush, the precious journal thumping against his ribs. The guards were close behind, their shouts cutting through the wind and rain. He was running for his life, carrying the weight of hundreds of other lives in the lining of his coat. Elias ran with a desperation he hadn't felt since the battlefield. The manicured grounds of the sanatorium gave way to the wild, unforgiving Pennsylvania forest. Branches tore at his face and clothes, and the rain-slicked ground sent him stumbling. But he never let go of the coat containing the journal. The shouts of the guards behind him grew fainter as he pushed deeper into the woods, his fear giving way to a primal need to survive and expose the truth. He ran for what felt like hours, long after the sounds of pursuit had faded, until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. He collapsed at the base of a massive oak tree, shivering and exhausted, where he spent a fitful night, half-conscious and haunted by the secrets he now carried. At dawn, he staggered on, using the rising sun to guide him east, towards civilization. 2 days later, looking more like a wild-eyed vagrant than a respectable Boston physician, he stumbled into the outskirts of Harrisburg. He was a wreck, gaunt, bruised, his fine clothes in tatters. He made his way to the state police headquarters, a place of authority and order that felt like it belonged to another universe. He demanded to see the highest-ranking official and was met, predictably, with skepticism and suspicion. The desk sergeant saw a madman, but Elias, summoning the last of his strength, did not tell his full story. He simply said he had evidence pertaining to financial crimes committed by Dr. Alistair Finch and some of the most powerful families in the Commonwealth. Then he produced the journal. The moment the officer saw the names on the list, the senators, the industrialists, the judges, the entire dynamic shifted. This was no longer a madman's ranting. This was a political bomb. The skepticism in the room was replaced by a palpable, chilling tension. The state's chief prosecutor was summoned. Elias Thorne, the fugitive, was placed in protective custody. The reversal was stunning. The machine of justice, so often blind to the crimes of the wealthy and powerful, had been kick-started by the one thing it couldn't ignore, the threat of a scandal that could topple the state's entire power structure. The information contained within Dr. Finch's journal, once partially deciphered by Elias, sent shockwaves through the highest levels of state government. Within 48 hours, a plan was set in motion for a full-scale raid on the Finch-Croft Sanatorium, an operation of unprecedented scale and secrecy. A heavily armed contingent of over 50 state troopers was assembled, traveling in unmarked carriages to avoid tipping off any of Croft's potential informants in local law enforcement. They arrived at dawn, swarming the estate from all sides simultaneously, overwhelming the private security force before any alarm could be raised. What they found inside was a journey from a pleasant dream into the deepest circle of hell. The East Wing was just as it appeared, elegant, opulent, and eerily quiet. But as they breached the locked doors of the West Ward, the true horror began to unfold. They were met with a scene of unimaginable squalor and despair. Dozens of patients, men and women, were found in filthy, barren rooms, heavily sedated and suffering from severe malnutrition. Many were restrained in their beds. A smell of decay and misery hung thick in the air. But the true chamber of horrors lay in the sub-basement, the existence of which Elias had described, but whose reality was far worse. In the surgical theater, they found bloodstains on the floor and on a crude operating table equipped with leather restraints. They found trays of terrifying, non-standard surgical instruments, ice picks, sharpened drills, saws. In the adjoining cells, they found a handful of prisoners who had been subjected to Finch's most extreme experiments. Individuals so psychologically and physically damaged, they were barely recognizable as human. The most gruesome discovery, however, was made on the grounds behind the incinerator. Following Elias's and the stable boy Finn's accounts, investigators began to excavate the area. They soon unearthed a mass grave, a pit filled with the skeletal remains of dozens of men, women, and what appeared to be infants, the failed experiments and silenced victims of the Finch brothers' decade-long reign of terror. The beautiful sanatorium, the symbol of hope and healing, was revealed to be nothing more than a private, industrialized slaughterhouse. The raid culminated in the arrest of the twin architects of this nightmare. Dr. Alistair Finch was taken into custody in his luxurious office, surrounded by his books and accolades. When the troopers burst in, he showed no surprise, no fear, only a kind of weary disappointment. He maintained his composure, expressing a calm certainty that this was all a grotesque misunderstanding fueled by a disgruntled, delusional former employee. Even in handcuffs, he projected an aura of wounded dignity and intellectual superiority, attempting to charm and reason with his captors as if they were merely confused students. His public mask was so deeply ingrained that he seemed incapable of taking it off. His brother, Silas, was found in his own Spartan office in the administrative wing, methodically burning ledgers in his fireplace. Unlike Alistair, Silas did not speak a single word. He did not resist arrest. He simply stared at the troopers with an expression of pure, cold contempt. As the two brothers, identical in appearance but starkly different in their reactions, were led out in chains, the news began to spread like wildfire. The initial reports were met with disbelief by the public and the press. Dr. Alistair Finch, the celebrated humanitarian, the genius physician, a monster. It seemed impossible. But as details of the raid began to leak out, whispers of the squalor in the West Ward, the discovery of the surgical theater, the unearthing of the mass grave, that disbelief curdled into a nationwide sensation of horror and betrayal. The unmasking of the Finch brothers was more than just the exposure of two criminals. It was the shattering of a deeply held belief in the sanctity of medicine and the benevolence of the elite. The men who had been celebrated as saviors were now revealed to be butchers, and their pristine white sanatorium was nothing but a beautifully painted tomb. As investigators, led by a vindicated Dr. Elias Thorne, painstakingly worked through the mountain of evidence recovered from the sanatorium, the true scope of the Finch-Croft operation came into horrifying focus. This was not merely the work of two mad brothers confined to a secluded Pennsylvania valley. Alistair Finch's coded journals, once fully deciphered, revealed a sprawling, clandestine network that stretched across the American East Coast. They contained records of correspondence with dozens of other individuals who were, at a minimum, professionally negligent and, at worst, criminally complicit. There were prominent physicians in Boston and New York who had referred their wealthy clients' inconvenient relatives to Finch, receiving handsome consultation fees in return. They provided falsified medical diagnoses of hysteria or hereditary madness to justify the commitments, knowing full well the patients were often perfectly sane. There were powerful family patriarchs, titans of industry and politics, whose letters to Finch spoke in chillingly candid terms about their desire to be rid of a troublesome wife or a disappointing heir. The journal was a ledger of human trafficking among the elite, where people were bought and sold under the guise of medical care. The investigation also uncovered financial records showing that Silas Croft had established shell corporations to launder the vast sums of money flowing in, investing it in legitimate businesses to further obscure its sickening origin. The international dimension was perhaps the most shocking. Alistair had maintained correspondence with a small, secretive circle of eugenicists and racial scientists in Germany and England, sharing his research and methodologies. He saw himself as part of an international vanguard, pioneering the techniques that would be necessary to purify the human race on a global scale. The Finch-Croft Sanatorium was not just a prison or a hospital. It was the pilot program, the laboratory for a monstrous international ideology that was just beginning to stir in the darkest corners of scientific thought. The crime was not just murder. It was a conspiracy that implicated an entire class of people. The trial of Silas Croft Finch and the posthumous indictment of his brother Alistair became the sensation of the decade, yet it was also a masterclass in how the powerful protect their own. As the case moved forward, a pervasive and deeply unsettling conspiracy of silence began to descend. The prominent families whose names were found in Finch's ledgers, the ones who had knowingly consigned their own flesh and blood to his chamber of horrors, marshaled their immense resources. They hired the best lawyers in the country, who argued successfully to have their clients' names sealed from public record, citing medical privacy and family honor. They used their influence to pressure newspaper editors, ensuring that the coverage focused almost exclusively on the singular depravity of the Finch brothers. framing the case as the story of two uniquely evil men rather than a systemic sickness within the aristocracy. The narrative was carefully managed. Alistair was a mad scientist, Silas his brutish enforcer. The families were portrayed as tragic, trusting victims who had been duped by Finch's sterling reputation. The dozens of complicit doctors who had served as feeders for the sanatorium were allowed to quietly resign their hospital posts or retire, their involvement erased from the official record. Dr. Elias Thorne, the hero who had risked his life to expose the truth, found himself sidelined and even subtly discredited. Lawyers for the defense painted him as an ambitious upstart, a man with a personal vendetta who had exaggerated his claims. The societal conspiracy was clear. It was better to sacrifice the full truth than to admit that the very foundations of their polite society were rotten with a murderous hypocrisy. The trial became less about justice for the dead and more about damage control for the living, a collective, unspoken agreement to bury the most inconvenient parts of the story and protect the fragile illusion of their own respectability. In the end, the legal system delivered a fractured and deeply unsatisfying form of justice. The key players in this saga met fates that seemed strangely mismatched to the scale of their sins. Dr. Alistair Finch, the charismatic mastermind, never faced a jury. 2 weeks before the trial was set to begin, he was found hanging in his jail cell, having used his own bedsheets to craft a noose. He left behind a 10-page letter, not of confession, but of intellectual justification, a final, arrogant manifesto proclaiming his work was a necessary sacrifice for the future of humanity. His suicide was the ultimate act of control, allowing him to escape judgment and frame himself as a martyr to his cause. His brother, Silas Croft Finch, the silent enforcer, faced the court alone. His high-priced lawyers argued brilliantly that he was merely a subordinate, a man acting under the powerful influence of his genius, mentally dominant twin. With many of the most damning financial records having been burned, and with influential families refusing to testify, the prosecution struggled to prove the full extent of his role as co-conspirator. He was convicted not of murder, but of lesser charges including criminal conspiracy and unlawful imprisonment. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but, thanks to the continued legal maneuvering of his hidden patrons, was quietly paroled after just 12. Upon his release, he vanished, his vast, ill-gotten fortune likely waiting for him, allowing him to live out the rest of his days in anonymous luxury. Nurse Eva Brandt, the fanatical head matron, suffered a complete mental breakdown upon learning of Dr. Finch's suicide. The collapse of her idol shattered her mind. Deemed unfit to stand trial, she was committed to a state asylum, spending the rest of her life as a patient in the very type of institution she had once so cruelly lorded over. And our heroes? The stable boy Finn O'Malley was publicly vindicated, but the trauma and social ostracism he endured left him a broken man. He remained a recluse for the rest of his life, forever haunted by the image in the fire. Dr. Elias Thorne, despite his heroic actions, was pushed to the fringes of the medical community. He dedicated his life to advocating for patients' rights and reforming mental health care, but he was forever marked by the darkness he had uncovered, a man who had seen the abyss and could never truly look away. The legacy of the Finch-Croft Sanatorium is one of shadows and whispers. After the trial, the estate was seized by the state, and the buildings were deemed so irredeemably tainted that they were systematically torn down, stone by stone, until nothing remained but overgrown foundations. The official records of the case were sealed, and the story was allowed to fade from the headlines and from the pages of mainstream history. Over time, the horrific documented truth of the sanatorium dissolved into a local ghost story, a tale told to frighten children about the mad doctor twins who once haunted the valley. The true scope of the crime, the eugenics, the conspiracy, the complicity of the elite, was successfully buried. But the moral of this story is not about ghosts. It's about the very real monsters that can thrive under the protective cloaks of respectability, progress, and science. It's a terrifying reminder of how easily evil can flourish when it serves the needs of the powerful. The Finch brothers were able to commit their atrocities for over a decade, not because they were supernaturally clever, but because society, or at least the powerful segment of it, implicitly agreed to look the other way. They provided a service that their clients desperately wanted, and that demand created the monster. This story forces us to ask ourselves a deeply uncomfortable question. Was the evil of the Finch brothers an anomaly, a freak occurrence? Or were they simply a product of their time, a symptom of a sickness, the obsession with purity, the dehumanization of the unfit, the willingness to sacrifice the inconvenient that lies dormant within society itself? The horror is not that two men were monsters, but that an entire world of wealth and privilege was willing to pay them to be. So now that you've heard the story, the real story, I have to ask you, what do you truly think? Could a horror of this magnitude, a conspiracy this deep, remain hidden for so long in our modern world? With our technology, our media, our supposed enlightenment, do you believe that similar crimes disguised as medicine or progress could be happening right now, hidden behind the walls of wealth and power? Let me know your honest thoughts in the comments below. This is what Shadow Stories is all about, not just telling the tales, but grappling with the terrifying questions they leave behind. If you believe these forgotten histories need a voice, please subscribe and share this video. Help us drag these truths into the light.